The morning sun cast long shadows across the community center steps as Thomas Wilson arrived for another day of work. At 58, his salt and pepper hair and the deep lines around his eyes told stories of both struggle and triumph. People in the neighborhood often said you could see the weight of history in his walk, steady, purposeful, and unhurried. Thomas wasn't just any lawyer. He was the man who had spent 30 years fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," called the security guard as Thomas pushed through the glass doors. "Saw you on TV last night. You really gave them something to think about." Thomas smiled and raised his coffee cup in greeting. "Just saying what needs to be said, Carl. Just saying what needs to be said." The truth was, Thomas hadn't planned on becoming the face of police reform in the city. He'd started out handling everyday cases, helping families with housing problems, sorting out small business disputes, the kind of legal work that kept a community functioning. But over time, patterns emerged that he couldn't ignore. The same neighborhoods facing the same problems, the same families cycling through the system, the same police officers' names appearing in complaint after complaint. His office was nothing fancy, just a room with worn furniture, walls covered with framed newspaper clippings, community awards, and family photos. The desk was buried under stacks of papers and legal documents. Thomas had always said he was too busy making change to worry about organizing his space. "Coffee's fresh," said Diane, his assistant for nearly 20 years. She'd started working for him right after high school and now ran the entire office. And the mayor's office called again. "Third time this week." Thomas sighed and dropped his weathered leather briefcase beside his chair. "Tell them I'll call back after the community meeting tonight. They know where I stand on the bill." The police accountability legislation had been Thomas's focus for the past 18 months. What made it special wasn't just what it would do, creating civilian oversight boards with real power, requiring body cameras, changing how complaints were handled, but who supported it. Thomas had done what few thought possible. He'd brought together community activists, responsible police officers, business leaders, and politicians from both parties. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Dad, you're trending again. Don't forget to eat lunch." At that moment, a young man appeared in the doorway, looking nervous. Thomas recognized him immediately. The younger brother of a teenager who'd been beaten during a mistaken arrest last year. "Mr. Wilson, got a minute? My brother's case. There's something new." "Come in, son," Thomas said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "There's always time." This was how most of Thomas's days went. A constant flow of people needing help, strategy meetings for the legislation, community organizing, and preparation for the cases he still personally handled. He'd become more than a lawyer. He was a bridge between worlds that rarely communicated honestly with each other. As lunchtime approached, Thomas walked to his favorite diner 3 blocks away. He'd been eating the same turkey sandwich there every Tuesday for nearly a decade. "The usual, Mr. Wilson?" asked the owner, reaching for the menu more out of habit than necessity. "You know it, Frank," Thomas replied, sliding into his regular booth by the window. The diner filled with the usual mix of people: office workers, neighborhood residents, even a couple of police officers. One of them, Officer Rivera, nodded respectfully at Thomas. They'd worked together on community outreach programs, the kind of initiatives Thomas believed made real differences in police-community relations. "Heard your bill's getting a vote next month," Rivera said, stopping by Thomas's table. "Got some pushback from the old guard, but most of us on the street support it. Need change if we're gonna rebuild trust." "Glad to hear it," Thomas replied. "We need good officers like you speaking up." Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas's phone ringing. It was the governor's office, another call about the legislation that was making waves across the state. The bill had started locally but was gaining attention nationwide as a potential model for other cities struggling with similar issues. After lunch, Thomas visited the high school where he ran a weekly program teaching students about their rights and responsibilities when interacting with law enforcement. Today's class was packed. Word had spread after his recent television appearances. "Mr. Wilson, is it true you used to be against the police?" asked one student, a quiet girl who rarely spoke up. Thomas shook his head. "I've never been against the police. I'm against abuse of power. Big difference. We need good policing. What we don't need is a system that protects bad behavior." The students hung on his every word. For many of them, Thomas represented something rare, an adult who took their concerns seriously and had actually managed to change things. Some of these teenagers had parents who had taken Thomas's same class 20 years earlier. "How do you not get angry?" asked another student. "After everything you've seen?" Thomas thought for a moment before answering. "Who says I don't get angry? I feel it just like you do. But I learned long ago that anger without purpose just burns you up inside. Focused anger, channeled into action, that's powerful. That's how mountains move." By late afternoon, Thomas was back at his office preparing for the community meeting that evening. The meeting would bring together neighborhood representatives, police department officials, and local politicians to discuss the final amendments to the legislation. His phone lit up with another text, this time from his wife of 35 years. "Don't forget dinner after your meeting." "I mean it this time." Thomas smiled. Lisa had been his rock through everything. The threats during high-profile cases, the late nights, the disappointments when justice seemed out of reach. She understood his mission because she shared it, working as a school principal in the same neighborhood where they'd both grown up. As the day wound down, Diane poked her head in his door. The news station called. "They want you on again tomorrow morning to talk about the bill?" Thomas nodded. Though public speaking had never been his favorite part of the job, he'd become good at it through necessity, not natural talent. His power came not from flashy rhetoric but from his authenticity. People trusted him because he'd earned that trust one case, one meeting, one person at a time over decades of consistent work. "Almost forgot," Diane added. "That footage came in from the Henderson incident. The family dropped it off this morning." Thomas's expression turned serious. The Henderson case involved a local business owner who claimed officers had planted evidence during a search of his store. If true, it could affect dozens of similar cases and highlight exactly why the new legislation was needed. "I'll review it tonight after the meeting," he said, already mentally rearranging his schedule. As evening approached, Thomas stood at his office window, looking out over the neighborhood he'd served for 3 decades. He could see the community center where he'd teach free legal classes on weekends, the park where he'd helped negotiate peace between rival youth groups, and the corner where he'd once been stopped and harassed by police himself as a young man, an experience that had helped shape his life's work. His phone buzzed, with news alerts about the upcoming vote on his legislation. National media had picked up the story, framing it as a potential turning point in police-community relations. Thomas knew the spotlight brought both opportunities and dangers. Too much attention could politicize what needed to be a practical, not partisan solution. "Car's here," Diane called from the outer office. "Don't forget your notes for tonight." Thomas gathered his materials, his mind already working through the key points he needed to make at the meeting. The legislation wasn't perfect, compromise never was, but it represented real progress. After decades of incremental change, this could be the breakthrough that made a lasting difference. As he headed for the door, he paused at the framed photo of his father on the wall, a factory worker who'd never finished high school, but who had taught Thomas the values that guided him still: dignity, perseverance, and the belief that one person standing firmly for what's right can inspire others to stand too. "Big night, Dad," he whispered to the photo, a ritual he'd maintained for years. Outside, the evening air carried the sounds of the neighborhood. Children playing, music from open windows, the distant siren of an ambulance. This was his world, these were his people, and tonight might bring them one step closer to the justice they deserved. Thomas straightened his tie, checked that he had his reading glasses, and headed toward the waiting car. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight was about taking one more step forward on the long road toward change. The community meeting had run later than expected. Thomas checked his watch as he walked to his car, nearly 11:30 p.m. His wife Lisa had texted twice, the second message just saying, "Cold plate in the fridge." He smiled, knowing she understood. These late nights were part of the job, especially now with the police accountability bill so close to a vote. The meeting had gone well. Even those who initially opposed RTS of the legislation were coming around. Thomas had a gift for listening to concerns and finding common ground without compromising on core principles. Tonight he'd managed to win over 2 skeptical business owners who worried about how the changes might affect neighborhood security. The parking lot was almost empty now. Thomas's old blue sedan sat alone under a flickering streetlight. He fumbled with his keys, his mind still processing the evening's discussions and planning tomorrow's follow-up calls. The drive home would take about 20 minutes through quiet streets. Thomas rolled down his window slightly, letting the cool night air help keep him alert. He turned onto Madison Avenue, the main road that would take him most of the way home. The radio played softly, a late-night jazz program he often enjoyed after long meetings. In his rearview mirror, Thomas noticed headlights approaching rapidly from behind. The car, a police cruiser, pulled up close behind him, lights suddenly flashing but no siren. Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever he saw police lights, a reaction born from both personal experience and years representing clients who'd faced harassment. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, using the same advice he gave in his community workshops. He signaled and pulled to the curb, positioning his car properly. His hands moved deliberately to the steering wheel, resting at the 10 and 2 positions where they would be visible. 2 officers approached, one on each side of the car. Thomas noticed they didn't follow standard procedure. The passenger side officer should have stayed back as a safety measure. Both had their hands near their weapons, which seemed unnecessary for what should be a routine traffic stop. The officer at his window shined a flashlight directly in Thomas's face. License and registration, no greeting, no explanation for the stop. Another procedural violation? Thomas noted these details automatically, the lawyer in him cataloging everything. "Good evening, officer," Thomas said calmly. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" "Taillights out," said the officer, a white man whose nameplate read Officer Brennan. His tone was curt, impatient. Thomas knew his taillights were fine. He'd had the car serviced just last week. But he also knew this wasn't the time to argue. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket. And then for my registration in the glove compartment," Thomas narrated his movements clearly, the way he taught others to do. The officer on the passenger side, Officer Reynolds, according to his nameplate, watched with narrowed eyes. "Just hurry it up." As Thomas handed over his license and registration, Officer Brennan's expression changed. There was a flicker of recognition. "Thomas Wilson," he read aloud. "The lawyer? The one always on TV talking about police." Thomas remained calm. "Yes, I'm an attorney working on community relations and legal reform." Officer Reynolds circled around to join his partner. Well, Mr. Bigshot Lawyer. Out pretty late, aren't you? Coming from a bar?" "I'm returning from a community meeting about the accountability legislation," Thomas explained. "I don't drink alcohol." "Step out of the car," Brennan ordered suddenly. Thomas knew his rights. "May I ask why that's necessary?" "If there's a taillight issue, I'd be happy to—" "I said get out of the car." Brennan's voice rose sharply. "Now!" Thomas noticed movement across the street. A small group of people had come out of the late-night laundromat, watching the scene unfold. One young man had his phone out filming. Thomas felt both concerned and relieved. Witnesses could be crucial, but he also worried the situation might escalate with an audience. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas opened his door and stepped out. He stood straight, hands visible, movements careful. "I'm complying, officers, but I'd like to understand the reason for—" "Hands on the car. Spread your legs," Reynolds ordered, cutting him off. Thomas did as instructed, though every instinct told him this stop had nothing to do with the taillight. As a civil rights attorney, he'd heard this same story from countless clients. Pretextual stops that turned into harassment. "You're that troublemaker trying to tie our hands with that new bill," Brennan said, his voice low as he roughly patted Thomas down. "Making our jobs impossible." "The legislation actually supports good policing," Thomas replied evenly. "Many officers are in favor of it." "Shut up," Reynolds snapped. "Nobody asked for your opinion." Across the street, the group of witnesses had grown. Several had phones out now. Thomas could hear someone saying they were streaming live. Brennan seemed to notice too. His demeanor changed, becoming more formal, though his eyes remained hard. "Sir, have you been drinking tonight?" "No, I have not," Thomas answered. "As I mentioned, I'm coming from a community meeting about—" "I smell alcohol," Reynolds interrupted, looking at his partner meaningfully. "Don't you smell it?" Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He knew this tactic, creating a false justification after the fact. "Officers, I have not consumed any alcohol. There are witnesses watching this interaction, and I'm respectfully asserting my rights." Brennan's face flushed with anger. Are you threatening me? Telling me how to do my job? Before Thomas could respond, Reynolds grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. Pain shot through his shoulder as the officer pushed him roughly against the car. You're being detained for suspected DUI, Reynolds announced loudly, clearly playing to the audience across the street. This is unnecessary, Thomas said, his voice strained but still controlled. I've cooperated fully. There's no cause for stop resisting, Brennan shouted, though Thomas wasn't resisting at all. The words sent another chill through him. In his decades as an attorney, he'd seen how the phrase, stop resisting, often preceded escalation of force, sometimes with tragic consequences. From across the street, voices rose in protest. He's not resisting, someone called out. We're recording everything. Reynolds leaned close to Thomas's ear. Your fancy friends can't help you now, Mr. Wilson. Maybe you'll think twice about that bill after tonight. The handcuffs snapped around Thomas's wrists, unnecessarily tight. He winced but remained silent, knowing anything he said could be twisted against him. The officers were clearly hoping he would lose his composure. A police van turned the corner and pulled up behind them. It had been called before they even approached his car, Thomas realized. This had been planned. What about my car? Thomas asked as they began moving him toward the van. My personal belongings? It'll be impounded, Brennan said with a shrug. Standard procedure for DUI suspects. I demand a breathalyzer test immediately, Thomas said firmly. And blood test if necessary. I have not been drinking. The officers exchanged glances but didn't respond. Thomas knew why. Any test would prove his sobriety, undermining their pretext for the arrest. As they reached the van, Thomas saw that the crowd across the street had grown to at least a dozen people. Many were filming. Some were on phones apparently calling for help. He recognized a few faces from the neighborhood, a retired teacher, a local shop owner, a student from his rights education class. Mr. Wilson, we're calling the community center. The student called out. We're getting help. Thomas nodded, grateful for their presence. Please contact my wife, he called back, and Diane at my office. Brennan roughly pushed Thomas's head down as they forced him into the van. Quite the performance, he muttered. But where we're going, nobody's watching. Thomas felt real fear now, not for himself, but for what these officers might do next. He'd heard too many stories of what happened in the gaps between public view and official processing. Inside the van, Thomas steadied his breathing. He recited to himself the advice he'd given countless clients. Stay calm. Remember details. Ask for a lawyer. Make no statements. Through the small window, he could see people running alongside the van as it pulled away. Still filming, still bearing witness. His phone had been taken, but word would spread quickly. Lisa would know soon. Diane would mobilize the legal team. The community would rally. As the van turned a corner, taking him away from the witnesses, Officer Reynolds looked back at him with a cold smile. Hope it was worth it, getting involved in things that aren't your business. Thomas met his gaze steadily. Justice is everyone's business, officer. The van continued through darkened streets, taking a route Thomas didn't recognize. Not the direct path to the police station. His professional mind noted this as another irregularity, while his human instincts registered it as danger. Yet amid the fear and uncertainty, Thomas felt something else too, a grim confirmation of everything he'd been fighting against. This moment, painful as it was, would ultimately strengthen the case for reform. The officers couldn't have given him more powerful evidence if they'd tried. As the van slowed at an intersection, Thomas caught sight of his reflection in the window glass. A man in handcuffs. A man being targeted for standing up for others. His father's words came back to him from long ago. Sometimes doing right comes with a cost. Pay it gladly. Thomas straightened his shoulders as much as the handcuffs would allow. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same dignity and courage he'd always tried to bring to his work. And one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of his story, not by a long shot. Word of Thomas Wilson's arrest spread like wildfire. By midnight, the videos taken by witnesses had been shared thousands of times across social media. By dawn, they had reached national news outlets. The footage clearly showed Thomas being compliant and respectful, while the officers grew increasingly aggressive without provocation. Lisa Wilson had been asleep when her phone rang. The caller was a community member she'd never met, a young man who'd been at the laundromat across from where Thomas was arrested. "Mrs. Wilson, they've taken your husband," he'd told her, his voice urgent but controlled. "We've got it all on video. This wasn't right." Now at 7 a.m., Lisa sat in the living room of their modest home surrounded by a growing circle of support. Diane, Thomas's assistant, had arrived within an hour of the call, already working the phones. Two young lawyers from Thomas's office were setting up laptops on the dining room table, reaching out to contacts in the police department, court system, and media. "Still nothing from central booking," said one of the lawyers, looking up from his screen. "They claim they have no record of him being processed." Lisa's face tightened with worry. The fact that Thomas hadn't been officially booked meant he was still in transit, or being held somewhere unofficially, a dangerous gray area. "The videos have passed 1 million views," Diane reported, scrolling through her phone. "People are gathering at the main police station downtown." "We need to be strategic," Lisa said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Thomas would want us to channel this energy constructively." She'd spent 35 years married to one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys. She knew how the system worked, both its official channels and its shadowy corners. More importantly, she knew what Thomas would do in this situation. "Get me Pastor Michael on the phone," she told Diane. "And Councilwoman Rodriguez. We need level heads leading this response." Outside, a news van had parked across the street. More would follow soon. Lisa knew that how they handled the next few hours would determine whether this crisis became a spark for positive change or descended into chaos that could be used to discredit Thomas's work. Her phone buzzed, with a text message from an unknown number. "We have him at East Precinct. Not Western, as dispatch reported. No charges filed yet. Eyes on him. He's okay. Friend?" Lisa showed the message to Diane. They both knew what it meant. Someone inside the system was trying to help, letting them know Thomas's actual location and that he was being watched over by allies. "I'll redirect our legal team to East," Diane said quietly. By mid-morning, the community's response had taken shape, guided by the principles Thomas had always advocated. Outside East Precinct, several hundred people had gathered, not as an angry mob, but as an organized presence. Community leaders took turns speaking through a small sound system. Legal observers in bright yellow vests documented everything. Volunteers distributed water and snacks. Medical professionals stood ready to help if needed. Among the crowd was a diverse cross-section of the city. Young activists, elderly church members, business owners, parents with children, off-duty teachers. Many carried signs with messages like "Justice for Thomas Wilson" and "We are watching." Luis Garcia, owner of the corner store where Thomas bought his coffee each morning, had closed his shop to be there. "When my place got robbed last year, Mr. Wilson helped me with the insurance company for free," he told a reporter. "He's always stood up for us. Now we stand up for him." Inside the precinct, officers watched the growing crowd with a mixture of emotions. Some were uncomfortable, recognizing faces of community members they worked with regularly. Others were defensive, seeing the gathering as an attack on their profession. And a few, particularly those who had worked with Thomas on community initiatives, were openly concerned about what had happened. Officer Chen, who had partnered with Thomas on youth outreach programs, approached her captain. "Sir, the situation is escalating unnecessarily. Wilson has collaborated with our department for years." "Not our call," the captain replied tersely. "Orders from above. They're saying he resisted arrest and showed signs of intoxication." "With all due respect, sir, I've seen the videos. That's not what happened." The captain gave her a warning look. "Careful, Chen. Stay in your lane." Outside, Lisa Wilson had arrived with Pastor Michael and Councilwoman Rodriguez. The crowd parted respectfully to let them through to the precinct steps. Lisa carried herself with the same dignified strength that characterized her husband, her face showing concern, but not panic. Councilwoman Rodriguez approached the officers guarding the entrance. "I'm here to see Chief Barnes immediately regarding Thomas Wilson." Inside, Thomas sat alone in an interrogation room. They had kept him there for hours without formal processing. Another violation of procedure. His requests for a phone call had been ignored. His shoulder ached where Officer Reynolds had twisted his arm, and the handcuffs had left raw marks on his wrists. But Thomas's mind remained clear. He'd spent decades preparing others for situations like this. Now he was living it himself, using the same techniques he taught, staying calm, documenting everything mentally, asserting rights persistently but respectfully. The door opened, and Chief Barnes entered with another officer Thomas didn't recognize. The chief's expression was unreadable. "Mr. Wilson," he said, "it seems we have a situation developing." "A situation of your department's making," Thomas replied evenly. "I've been detained for hours without cause, denied my phone call, and held without processing. Meanwhile, I assume my community is worried and responding." The chief nodded slowly. "There are several hundred people outside. News vans, city council members, your wife." Thomas felt a surge of pride and gratitude. This was exactly what he'd been building for decades. Not just legal strategies, but community, organization, and solidarity. Officers Brennan and Reynolds violated at least 7 departmental policies during my detention, Thomas said, all captured on video by multiple witnesses. "This can go one of 2 ways, Chief. It can become a lengthy public battle that damages your department's relationship with the community for years. Or it can become a turning point, a moment when your leadership demonstrates that accountability isn't just a word on paper." Outside, the crowd had grown to over 1,000. What made it remarkable wasn't just its size, but its discipline. People who might normally avoid each other, religious conservatives and young progressives, business owners and housing activists, stood shoulder to shoulder, united by their respect for Thomas and what he represented. Lisa had established a command center in a coffee shop across from the precinct. Volunteer lawyers took statements from the original witnesses. Social media teams made sure accurate information circulated instead of rumors. Medical students created a rotation schedule so protesters could rest. "This is exactly what Thomas has been teaching us for years," Pastor Michael observed. "Organized, peaceful, strategic resistance. The difference," Lisa said, "is that usually he's the one running things." A young officer approached their table looking nervous. "Mrs. Wilson? The chief would like to speak with you and Councilwoman Rodriguez." "Just the 2 of you." Lisa exchanged glances with the councilwoman. "Tell him we'll be right there." As they crossed the street toward the precinct, Lisa noticed something remarkable. The crowd, which had been chanting "Free Thomas Wilson," fell silent as she passed. It was a gesture of respect, but also of trust. They were following her lead, confident she would represent their concerns. Inside the chief's office, they found Thomas sitting in a chair, finally unhandcuffed. His clothes were rumpled and he looked tired, but his eyes lit up at the sight of his wife. "Negotiations are underway," the chief said before Lisa could speak. "Mr. Wilson has made some valid points about last night's incident." Thomas gave Lisa a slight nod, letting her know he was okay and had the situation under control. "This isn't just about one incident," Lisa said, addressing the chief. "This is about a pattern that Thomas has been documenting for years. A pattern your department has repeatedly denied. I'm prepared to acknowledge that there may be issues requiring review," the chief said carefully. "Maybe," Councilwoman Rodriguez repeated. "Chief, there are videos showing 2 of your officers explicitly targeting a prominent civil rights attorney because of his work on legislation they personally oppose. This goes beyond review. This requires immediate action." Outside, the crowd continued to grow. News helicopters circled overhead. The mayor had called twice, increasingly concerned about the situation. Thomas stood up slowly, his body stiff from hours in custody. "Here's what happens next, Chief. I'm walking out that door and no charges are being filed because no crime was committed. Officers Brennan and Reynolds are placed on administrative leave pending investigation. And you personally commit to public hearings on the accountability legislation with your full support." The chief looked like he wanted to object, but the growing crowd outside and the news cameras told him everything he needed to know about his position. "I'll need to consult with—" "No," Thomas cut him off gently but firmly. "This moment requires leadership, not consultation. Your department is at a crossroads. I'm offering you a path forward that addresses legitimate grievances while respecting the difficult job your officers do." It was the same balanced approach that had made Thomas effective throughout his career, holding systems accountable while acknowledging the humanity of everyone involved. The chief looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Wilson, we'll do it your way." When Thomas walked out the front door of the precinct 20 minutes later, the roar from the crowd was deafening. Lisa's hand was firm in his as they stood together on the steps. He raised his free hand, and the crowd gradually fell silent. "Today," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the gathered faces, "we've witnessed the power of community in action, not through violence or destruction, but through solidarity and strategic pressure. This isn't just my victory, it's ours, and it's just the beginning." 3 days after Thomas Wilson walked free from East Precinct, the city announced an independent investigation into his arrest. The mayor, facing intense public pressure, appointed a respected former judge to lead the inquiry. What started as an investigation into a single incident quickly expanded as more troubling details emerged. Thomas sat in his home office, reviewing the preliminary findings with Lisa and Diane. His body was still sore from the rough handling during his arrest, but his resolve had only strengthened. "They've pulled the personnel files for both officers," Diane said, pointing to a section of the report. "Brennan has 7 prior complaints of excessive force. Reynolds has 5. None resulted in disciplinary action." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "This matches the pattern we've been documenting for years. Complaints filed, then buried." Lisa, who had taken a leave of absence from her principal position to help manage the growing movement, looked up from her laptop. The body camera footage finally came through. It directly contradicts their written report. The investigation had already yielded critical evidence. Body cameras from both officers had been activated during Thomas's arrest, though the department had initially claimed technical malfunctions prevented their release. After a court order, the footage appeared, showing clearly that Thomas had been cooperative throughout the encounter while the officers made explicit references to his work on the accountability legislation. "What's most interesting," Thomas said, "is what happened after they put me in the van. The cameras kept running." The footage showed Officers Brennan and Reynolds discussing their actions, unaware their cameras were still recording. Their conversation revealed not just personal bias but something more troubling: references to instructions from upstairs and making an example of Thomas. "This goes beyond 2 officers with grudges," Lisa said quietly. "It always did," Thomas replied. "The question is how high it goes and who else is involved." As the week progressed, the investigation expanded in scope. Independent investigators interviewed dozens of officers, reviewed years of complaint records, and examined the department's internal communication systems. They discovered a pattern of targeting community activists, particularly those involved with police reform efforts. At the community center, Thomas met with a diverse group of stakeholders: neighborhood leaders, police reform advocates, and several officers who supported accountability measures. Officer Chen, who had spoken up for Thomas inside the precinct, was among them. "More officers want to come forward," she told the group. "There's been an informal system for years. Officers who receive complaints are protected if they're loyal to certain higher-ups. Those who speak out get the worst assignments, no backup when they need it. We need to create a safe way for them to share what they know," Thomas said. "This isn't about attacking police as a whole. It's about rooting out the corruption that makes it harder for good officers to do their jobs." This had always been Thomas's approach, distinguishing between necessary police functions and abuses of power, between officers who served their communities and those who betrayed their oaths. It was an approach that built bridges rather than walls, creating space for reform that benefited everyone. The investigation took an unexpected turn when an anonymous whistleblower provided internal emails showing that Thomas had been under surveillance for months before his arrest. His phone had been tracked, his meetings monitored, his associates documented. The surveillance had been authorized outside normal channels with no warrants and no oversight. "They've been building a file on me," Thomas said, reviewing the evidence with his legal team, "looking for anything they could use. And when they couldn't find anything, they manufactured a reason to arrest you," added one of the young lawyers. The public hearings began in the second week. Held in the city council chambers and broadcast live, they drew massive audiences both in person and online. Thomas testified first, recounting his experience with a calm dignity that made the injustice all the more stark. "I've spent 30 years working within the system," he told the panel, "filing complaints through proper channels, pursuing remedies through the courts, drafting legislation with input from all stakeholders, including police. My arrest wasn't just an attack on me personally. It was an attempt to intimidate anyone who seeks accountability through lawful means. Officer Brennan and Reynolds refused to testify, citing their Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, but others from within the department stepped forward, despite the risks to their careers. A veteran detective described how complaint files would routinely disappear when they involved certain officers. A dispatcher explained how calls from specific neighborhoods were deliberately delayed. A records clerk detailed how arrest statistics were manipulated to target specific communities. Each testimony built upon the others, revealing not isolated incidents but a system designed to protect itself at the expense of those it was meant to serve. Midway through the second week of hearings, the investigation reached higher levels of the department. Captain Harris, who oversaw internal affairs, was placed on leave after emails revealed he had buried complaints against officers Brennan and Reynolds. Deputy Chief Williams resigned, rather than testify about his role in authorizing the surveillance of Thomas and other community leaders. Thomas watched these developments not with satisfaction but with a somber recognition of how deep the problems ran. This isn't about a few bad officers, he told reporters gathered outside the hearings. This is about systems that enable and protect misconduct. The same patterns exist in departments across the country. What's happening here is just more visible because they made the mistake of targeting someone who knew how to fight back. In his office late one evening, Thomas received an unexpected visitor, Chief Barnes himself. Coming alone and unofficially, "I've tendered my resignation," the chief said without preamble. "Effective next week," Thomas gestured to a chair. "I never wanted your job, you know." "I know that now." The chief sat heavily. "I joined the force 30 years ago to help people. Somewhere along the way, protecting the department became more important than protecting the public." "It's not too late to help fix it," Thomas said. "Your testimony could be powerful." The chief looked up, surprised. "You'd still work with me? After what happened?" "This has never been about individuals," Thomas replied. "It's about changing systems. Your perspective from the inside would be valuable." The next day, Chief Barnes testified voluntarily. He provided details about pressure from the police union to block the accountability legislation, about informal quotas that pushed officers to make unnecessary arrests, about how complaints against certain officers were routinely dismissed regardless of evidence. "I failed in my duty," the chief concluded. "I allowed a culture of impunity to flourish under my watch. Mr. Wilson's arrest was not an anomaly. It was the predictable result of that failure." As the third week of investigation began, attention turned to the role of city officials. Emails revealed that certain council members had been briefed about the surveillance of Thomas. The previous mayor had authorized special funds for monitoring community agitators, a list that included not just Thomas but pastors, teachers, and community organizers who had spoken out about police misconduct. The current mayor, initially reluctant to support the investigation, now embraced it fully, positioning himself as a reformer. Thomas viewed this political transformation with a mixture of skepticism and pragmatism. True change required both pressure from below and cooperation from above. The investigation's scope continued to widen, examining how complaint systems failed, how oversight boards lacked real power, how union contracts protected officers from consequences. Independent investigators accessed records going back 15 years, revealing patterns that couldn't be dismissed as isolated incidents. Thomas's legal team compiled the evidence into a comprehensive report, documenting not just what had happened to him, but the larger context of systemic failures. The report included recommendations for structural reforms, accountability measures, and community oversight with real authority. "This is what we've been working toward for years," Thomas told Lisa as they reviewed the final draft. "Not just identifying problems, but offering viable solutions. Do you think it will make a difference this time?" she asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. "The difference is that now we have irrefutable evidence, and more importantly, we have public attention. People who never thought about these issues are watching now. That creates a window for real change." Outside their home, a small group of supporters maintained a constant presence, not as protesters but as protectors, ensuring Thomas and his family remained safe from potential retaliation. Community members brought food, offered security expertise, or simply stood watch in shifts. It was a living demonstration of the networks of care and solidarity Thomas had helped build over decades. As the fourth week of investigation began, national media attention intensified. What had started as a local incident had become a case study in police accountability, sparking similar investigations in cities across the country. Thomas found himself receiving calls from attorneys and activists nationwide, seeking advice on how to replicate the process in their own communities. "The key is evidence," he told them. "Not just anecdotes but patterns, not just accusations but documentation, and most importantly, offering solutions that improve public safety for everyone, including good officers who want to do their jobs with integrity." This had always been Thomas's strength, not just identifying what was wrong, but showing a path forward that acknowledged complexity while insisting on fundamental rights. As he prepared for another day of testimony, Thomas reflected on how his personal ordeal had created an unexpected opportunity for the changes he'd spent his career fighting for. Sometimes, he thought, the most powerful testimony comes not from what we say but from what we endure. 6 months after Thomas Wilson's arrest, the city courthouse was packed for the announcement of the investigation's final conclusions. The independent commission had worked methodically, following evidence trails that led far beyond a single traffic stop on a quiet night. What they uncovered would transform not just local policing, but set a precedent for departments nationwide. Thomas sat in the front row beside Lisa, both of them dressed simply but formally for the occasion. Behind them sat dozens of community members who had stood by them throughout the process: neighborhood leaders, small business owners, young activists, and even several police officers who had broken ranks to support the investigation. Judge Eleanor Patterson, who had led the commission, approached the podium. A hush fell over the room. After 6 months of investigation, including review of thousands of documents, hundreds of hours of testimony, and extensive analysis of departmental records, this commission has reached unanimous conclusions, she began. The arrest of Thomas Wilson was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of systemic failures in oversight, accountability, and departmental culture. Thomas listened intently as she outlined the findings. The commission had identified a pattern of targeting community advocates, particularly those working on police reform. They had uncovered a shadow system within the department, where certain officers were protected from consequences regardless of their actions, while those who reported misconduct faced retaliation. Officers Brandon Brennan and Kevin Reynolds have been terminated from the police force and now face criminal charges for civil rights violations, falsification of reports, and abuse of authority. Judge Patterson continued. Additionally, 3 ranking officers who authorized or covered up these actions have been removed from their positions and face administrative penalties. This wasn't just about punishment, Thomas knew. It was about setting clear standards and consequences, the foundation of any functioning system of accountability. Beyond individual actions, this commission has identified structural issues requiring immediate reform. The judge continued. She outlined a comprehensive set of changes: a truly independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power, mandatory body cameras with strict penalties for deactivation, a complete overhaul of the complaint process, and regular external audits of departmental practices. Most significantly, the accountability legislation Thomas had been working on before his arrest would now be implemented in full, with additional provisions based on what the investigation had revealed. When the formal announcement concluded, reporters surrounded Thomas, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Wilson, do you feel vindicated?" one reporter called out. Thomas considered the question carefully. "This isn't about vindication for me personally. It's about validation for the thousands of people who've been telling these same stories for years without being heard. The difference is that I had the legal knowledge, the community support, and frankly, the visibility that many victims of police misconduct don't have." "What happens next?" another reporter asked. "The hard work begins," Thomas replied. "Changing laws and policies is just the first step. Changing culture and practice takes longer. That's why we've established a joint implementation committee with representatives from the community, the department, and city government to ensure these reforms take root." Later that evening, Thomas sat on his front porch with Lisa, taking a rare moment of quiet reflection. The past 6 months had been exhausting, Endless meetings, testimonies, interviews, and strategy sessions. But they had also been exhilarating, filled with possibility and progress that had seemed unattainable before. "I keep thinking about all the people who came forward," Lisa said, sipping her tea. "Not just the victims of misconduct, but the officers who risked their careers to tell the truth." Thomas nodded. "That's what gives me hope. Change never comes just from the outside pushing in. It needs people on the inside pulling in the same direction." This had always been Thomas's approach, building coalitions across dividing lines, finding common ground even with those who seemed like natural opponents. It wasn't always popular with more radical activists who sometimes saw him as too willing to compromise. But over decades it had proven effective at creating lasting change rather than momentary victories. In the weeks that followed, the implementation process began. Thomas was appointed to lead the Civilian Oversight Board, working closely with the new police chief, Officer Chen, who had been promoted in recognition of her integrity during the crisis. Together, they began the delicate work of rebuilding trust between the department and the community it served. The model they developed attracted attention far beyond their city. Representatives from police departments and community organizations across the country began visiting, studying the reforms being implemented, and adapting them for their own communities. 3 months after the commission's findings, Thomas was invited to Washington to testify before Congress about national police reform legislation. As he entered the historic chamber, he thought about how his personal ordeal had created an opportunity for change that might otherwise have taken decades to achieve. "The critical insight we've gained," he told the congressional committee, "is that accountability benefits everyone, the public, who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, but also the majority of officers who serve honorably and whose reputations are tarnished by those who abuse their authority." He described how their city's new system was already showing results. Civilian complaints had initially increased as people gained confidence in the process, but then began decreasing as officer behavior improved. Use of force incidents had declined significantly. Most surprisingly to some, officer morale had improved as the department's culture shifted toward genuine public service rather than an us versus them mentality. "True accountability isn't about punishment after the fact," Thomas explained. "It's about creating systems that encourage the right behavior from the beginning and address problems before they escalate. It's about changing the definition of what it means to be a good officer, from someone who protects their colleagues at all costs to someone who upholds the highest standards of their profession." Back home, the practical work continued. Thomas worked with the department to redesign training programs, emphasizing de-escalation techniques and community engagement. He helped establish neighborhood advisory councils, where residents and local officers could build relationships and address concerns before they became crises. And he continued teaching his community rights workshops, now with active participation from reform-minded officers. Officer Brennan and Reynolds ultimately accepted plea deals rather than go to trial, each receiving 3-year sentences for their actions. More significant than their individual punishment was the message their case sent throughout the law enforcement community, that the badge did not place anyone above the law. Former Deputy Chief Williams, who had authorized the surveillance of Thomas and other community leaders, cooperated with prosecutors and received probation in exchange for testimony that helped dismantle the department's informal protection system. His choice to come clean rather than maintain the blue wall of silence represented its own kind of progress. 1 year after his arrest, Thomas stood at the podium during the opening of the new Community Justice Center, a place where residents could file complaints, access legal resources, participate in mediation with officers, and contribute to public safety planning. The building symbolized the new relationship being forged between the police and the public. "A year ago, I experienced firsthand what many in our community have endured for generations," Thomas told the gathered crowd. "But unlike many, I had the resources and platform to demand accountability. Our challenge now is to ensure that every person, regardless of their position or profile, receives the same justice and respect." He looked out at the diverse faces before him. Community members, officers in uniform, city officials, and activists, all part of the coalition that had turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity for transformation. What happened to me was painful, Thomas continued, but it also revealed the truth of what we've been saying for years. Sometimes systems need to be broken open before they can be rebuilt. Sometimes it takes a crisis to create the will for change. And sometimes, just sometimes, injustice itself becomes the catalyst for justice. As he concluded his remarks, Thomas thought about the long arc of his career. From a young lawyer handling everyday cases to a nationally recognized advocate for police reform. The path had never been straight or easy. There had been victories and setbacks, moments of progress followed by painful backlashes. But through it all, he had maintained his faith in the power of persistent, strategic action to bend systems toward justice. This center is not the end of our journey, Thomas said. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. The work continues. It always does. Later, walking home with Lisa, Thomas passed a patrol car parked at the corner. The young officer inside rolled down his window and nodded respectfully. Thomas nodded back, recognizing him as one of the new recruits who had gone through the reformed training program. This, perhaps, was the most meaningful change of all, not just new policies or procedures, but a fundamental shift in how authority was understood and exercised. A generation of officers was emerging who saw accountability not as a threat, but as the foundation of their legitimacy and effectiveness. You know, Lisa said, as they continued walking. Your father would be proud, Thomas smiled, thinking of the factory worker who had taught him to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. He always said justice was like building a house, one brick at a time, with a solid foundation and the patience to see it through. Together they walked toward home, two ordinary people who had helped transform an act of injustice into a catalyst for extraordinary change.